Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Jeff Scheuer, a writer and independent scholar based in New York. Jeff's background is in philosophy, political theory, and journalism. And after graduating from the London School of Economics and Political Science and the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, he worked briefly as a reporter before deciding he wanted to take on larger issues. Thus far, Jeff's written 3 books. His first book, The Soundbite Society: How Television Helps the Right and Hurts the Left, was named a Choice Outstanding Academic title in 2000. His second, The Big Picture, explored why democracies need journalistic excellence. Jeff just recently published his third book, entitled Inside the Liberal Arts: Critical Thinking and Citizenship, and it's about how liberal learning, critical thinking, and citizenship form a golden triangle that's essential to a healthy democracy. Jeff joins us today to talk about how higher education abandoning a liberal education is doing a disservice to its students and the country. Jeff, welcome to the program.
Hey, Drumm. Great to be with you.
Great to have you on the program. You just came out with a new book entitled Inside the Liberal Arts: Critical Thinking and Citizenship. And I was fascinated when I read the background on it. It's really a great piece of work, and you really dig down into the key areas that, frankly, I think all college graduates should have. Before we get into that, though, please give our audience a little background on who you are and what drove you to write this book, because I know this isn't your first one.
Sure. Well, I came out of philosophy in school and political theory, and then I went to journalism school and worked briefly as a reporter before I realized that I wasn't meant for that line of work. I needed something broader and bigger to get my head around. So I started writing freelance, doing mostly book reviewing, then some commentary, some op-ed pieces, and then essays. And I ultimately wrote a book on media and politics called The Soundbite Society, which argued that television and electronic media generally help the right and hurt the left. That sound bites are a particular problem for progressive ideas and values. That got an interesting response, and I went on to write another book on journalism called The Big Picture: Why Democracies Need Journalistic Excellence, which is sort of self-explanatory as a follow-on to the first book. Then I was sort of casting around for something new, and social media were coming into the picture and confusing me and everyone else. And I felt I was sort of losing my grip on what journalism is, what news is, and so on, and needed to look in a new direction. So ultimately, I went back to my roots in philosophy, really, although there is a tie-in to media, definitely, which I'll get to. But I heard people saying critical thinking is important for the liberal arts, and the liberal arts promote critical thinking. And I was thinking, what does that mean? And as Mark Twain said about the weather, everyone complains about it, but no one ever does anything about it. So I decided to do something about it. I decided to look into what critical thinking is, what the liberal arts are, how they connect, and how they promote citizenship in a democracy. Well, that took a few years, needless to say, but here I am.
Well, very good. I'm glad you're able to join us. And this is really timely because Marymount University in Virginia is eliminating 9 liberal arts majors for undergraduates, English, history, math, economics. I don't see how they can say math is a liberal arts or economics, but, they're eliminating them.
Yeah.
And
well, in a broad sense, they are. Economics is part of the social sciences. I wouldn't say liberal arts are limited to the humanities, although they're often linked to the humanities. The social sciences, even natural science, can be conceived as part of the liberal arts because you can't really get a balanced critical education and leave nature out of the equation. It's too important, and we live in it. And we need to understand it as citizens. We need to understand difficult issues of technology and climate change and all that. So we need a little science too.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the concept of citizenship, because when we were speaking before, you were referring to economic citizenship, which is really the focus of where higher ed and the business community is here in the U.S., versus the actual citizenship that's necessary to run a democracy.
Right. I wouldn't say versus, but maybe along with, because what I'm arguing inside the liberal arts is that there are three main areas of citizenship that all interact with each other and affect each other. One is economic, one is civic, and the third is cultural. And the core of my argument in this part of the book is that we need STEM, we need vocational education, we need pre-professional, we need everything we can get. But if we leave out the liberal arts, we only get the economic part of citizenship, which is how to produce, how to consume, how to be part of the economy. We don't get all of the rest, the cultural, the civic, that we need to be full citizens.
So that we just kind of level set things for the audience. Let's talk a little bit, the civic domain. That's what?
Well, the most obvious part is voting, serving on juries, signing petitions, anything we do in the civic arena that gives us input. Citizenship is any kind of transaction between the individual and society that includes both give and take. We give taxes, we take services, for example. But in the civic arena, there are many different ways to do that. We can write postcards, we can try to change laws, we can try to keep laws. It's not about change per se, it's about change versus preventing change, whatever. It's not left or right, it's just citizenship. It's being part of the world you live in.
That makes perfect sense. And the cultural, I would assume that's the arts, things along those lines?
It's primarily what people think of as the arts, but I would include in many ways religion, religious institutions, sports institutions, because these are all public areas in which we have some impact and some conversation with others. They are sort of the coral beds on which we form communities as little citizen fish, so to speak. So they're just as important. And as I said before, the cultural things we do, the cultural conversations we have, whether it's over a ball game or a Cézanne painting, these all ultimately connect to the civic and to the economic. And I describe in the book exactly how they connect and why it's a complicated system. But that's why we need all three, and why this important as the STEM education is, it doesn't do the whole job.
Well, it sounds to me like you're bringing up the concept of higher education and public good, not just economic good.
That's correct. And I'm certainly not the first to do it. I mean, the great philosopher John Dewey was all about civic education. Robert Maynard Hutchins at University of Chicago. But if you go back to the founding of the Republic, Thomas Jefferson founded the University of Virginia. He put that on his gravestone as opposed to his being president, which he didn't mention. So that was important to him. He didn't found the Agricultural School of Virginia or the Technical School of Virginia. He founded it to produce not just ministers like some of the small religious colleges that started springing up at that time around New England, not just business people, but citizens generally. That was his vision, and that remains, although it remains debated and disputed, that remains the Jeffersonian vision for American education, is to produce citizenship, and that's what the liberal arts are all about.
Well, it reminds me, too, of Clark Kerr and the California experiment of how higher education was for the public good, and how citizenship requires, and some people will say it requires a liberal education. That's not what we're hearing nowadays.
It's not. And maybe I'm out of step with the times because I think Clark Kerr was right. I think Jefferson was right. I think one of the greatest pieces of legislation in American history was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, which we know as the GI Bill, which produced the mass prosperity of the 1950s and early 60s. It's unfortunate that that vision of the beneficial impact of investing in education has been lost, of how it raises all boats. It doesn't just make a few people smarter or more interesting. It raises all boats, and it raised the American boat in the 50s and 60s. In fact, there's a great book, not mine, but a great book that just came out by a writer named Will Bunch called After the Ivory Tower Falls, which is a history of how we lost that vision after the GI Bill. It's a beautiful book and a very nice complement to mine, I think.
But you're not arguing that everything needs to be liberal education.
No, absolutely not. There are many people who are incapable or uninterested or for whatever reason not suited for a liberal education, but I think as many people as can should be able to have it. And the more that can, I think, the better our democracy, because we'll have broader and fuller citizenship in the long run. If we only had STEM, if we only had technical and skill-oriented education, I think we'd live in a very bad way. We'd live in a very bad place, because there's no way a democracy can function based on people with only technical knowledge and no citizenship skills.
So what I'm hearing you say is, from a higher education perspective, we need to step back a little bit and take a look at what the purpose is of higher education. It's not only training people to be job ready and to create good citizens.
Absolutely. And personally, I put citizenship first. It's not always clear that being job ready is what's best for someone in the long run. I think Sean Decatur, when he was president of Kenyon, said that philosophers out-earn business majors in the long run. And that may be true. But more importantly, we need more civic education, not just in universities and colleges, but in high schools. We need, for example, civics section on the SAT and ACT tests. We have to have it taught so people have some sense of the society they're coming into and some sense of how they can affect it themselves.
Well, many people would argue that because society has become so technical and, the technology is driving things, that we need to have far more STEM graduates. What I'm hearing you say is STEM is important, but it needs to be infused. The liberal education needs to be infused into the STEM to create not only job-ready graduates, but more importantly, good citizens.
Absolutely. Maybe supplemented rather than infused would be a better way to describe the balancing that I'm looking for. The necessity for some civic and cultural and education for STEM students and so on. There has to be some better balance than simply assuming people like Governor DeSantis assume that all we need is to get people into jobs that aren't necessarily ever going to pay great, but are getting them through. I think that's a very blinkered vision for America.
I would tend to agree with you on that. As you said before, democracies cannot flourish without liberal arts. The STEM needs to be supplemented with this. Now, I think the challenge is, there's a lot of challenges with this. Students are graduating with a significant amount of debt. I mean, there's $1.7 trillion in student debt. Part of this is driven because the cost of higher ed has gone up, although just recently I read that's a misnomer, that it really hasn't gone up. Part of the challenge is that there's a lack of public funding for higher education,
right,
which is driving. The cost hasn't gone up that much. It's just the burden's gone to the student going through.
That's true, Drumm. And I would submit that retiring that debt would have a commensurate effect on our economy and on our culture that the GI Bill had in 1945 through the end of the 50s. It would be an enormous boon, not just to present day students who are in debt, but to their children, to their communities, to everybody. These things ramify across communities, allowing people to get educated, allowing people to buy a home and not be prevented because they have too much debt. We want people to be consumers. We don't want them to come out of college as paupers.
Interesting you say that, because not so long ago, I had a guest on the podcast who talked about the debt that students are coming out and their ability to get higher paid jobs to where they can pay that off. It's delaying them buying homes, making major purchases. It's really impacting the economy in a major way.
Starting families.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so let's swap horses just a little bit. I could continue to talk about this quite a bit. It's fascinating to me, but let's talk a little bit about job readiness. The skills, AAC&U came out with a study in 2018 and again in 2020, talking about what businesses need in graduates.
Right.
The top 3 in the 2018 report were oral communications, the ability to work in teams, and ethical judgment and decision-making. 2020, the ability to work in teams, critical thinking, the ability to analyze, interpret data. How do you get this stuff from a pure STEM education?
Yeah, you don't fully get it from a pure STEM education, Drumm. And I think it makes my case, or I make their case, because the fact is businesses are looking for liberal arts grads. They're not necessarily looking for people who studied business undergraduate. Similarly, editors are not looking for journalism majors. They're looking for liberal arts majors because they have broader educations. The same is true for culinary academies, culinary schools. Military academies have gone, and I think from personal experience, have re-emphasized the liberal arts in the last decade or so. West Point certainly has. They understand the complexity and the system-based thinking necessary to be a good soldier in the 21st century, and the cooperation and the communication it requires. All of those things come out of a liberal education, not out of a STEM education.
Which makes perfect sense, because the ability to think holistically, i.e. systems thinking,
yes,
it doesn't necessarily come from a STEM education, although it certainly can, but STEM is becoming so focused and so deep. You get an inch wide of information and you go 4 feet deep. You're becoming very specialized.
Right.
Whereas a liberal education tends to be broader, tends to be more inclusive. You have to think of large concepts versus specific small technical details.
And we don't want to be a society of citizens in our individual silos. The whole point of citizenship is connection.
Except that there's a lot of folks out there who have learned to connect via their electronic devices instead of face-to-face.
Not necessarily the healthiest or best way to connect, but we're stuck with it for now. And
well, we're both here a couple of boomers, and we're used to connecting in that way versus Gen X, Y, Z, and A. I mean, we're talking alphabet soup here.
And we've got AI coming down on us like a locomotive. I don't want to open the can of worms that involves, but we all know it's something we're going to have to reckon with at all levels in higher education and in K-12 education.
Maybe that's your next book.
Maybe.
Maybe you can get AI to write it for you.
If I'm smart enough. I did have an interesting experience with AI. I stuck my toe in the AI water recently. I asked it to write a little essay on liberal arts and democracy in 500 words. It did it in about 5 seconds, and it did it pretty well. So I was astonished. But when I asked it to talk about me, Jeffrey Scheuer, our Inside the Liberal Arts, it got a lot of its facts hilariously wrong. So it credited me, for example, with writing 5 or 6 wonderful essays that I didn't write and things like that. So the jury's still out on AI, and especially on how we rein in its bad consequences. But I don't want to get too off the subject on that.
Yeah, that we could spend a lot of time on that one. So backing up, higher ed has always been, and some of the things that critics have come out and said is we can't afford as a society to take 4 years off for undergraduates to socialize, et cetera, that they need to be focused, they need to come out ready to join the workforce, et cetera. Now, I know in our conversations, neither of us really agree with that completely, that higher ed needs to be a place apart for students to find themselves.
Yeah, no, if you follow that argument too far, you end up endorsing child labor and taking kids out of schools after 6th grade. I totally disagree with the premise of that argument. In fact, historically, we've had colleges in this country and universities, as everyone knows, since before we were a country. They studied in the early days mostly the classics, Latin and Greek. Then they broadened it out. These sectarian religious institutions became beacons of liberal education. The one I went to was a Quaker school that developed into a great college. So, no, we've become a superpower in the last 170 years since the Civil War in a country with primarily a liberal arts model of higher education. Not to the exclusion of STEM. We've always had technical and scientific education too, but in tandem with it. And that's going to have to be the way we continue if we want our democracy to succeed, because it doesn't work on a non-liberal arts basis. It just doesn't work.
I agree. I think, as we said earlier, we really need to supplement STEM with the liberal education. I remember back at my time at the Naval Academy, we had all the technical classes. I was a physics major, so I had my physics majors. I had all my naval science courses, but we were required to take liberal education courses.
Right. They teach philosophy there. They teach history there. Mm-hmm. They teach everything that a great university teaches. And you had what I would guess was a fairly ideal balance of STEM and non-STEM education.
I suspect you're right. I mean, when I think back, I think about my physics courses, but I also think about courses like Chaucer and His Age, where we read the Canterbury Tales in Middle English. Other things, law courses, torts, naval law, etc. There were plenty of, quote, liberal arts education that helped round us out to assume leadership roles once we graduated from the Naval Academy.
And by the way, you mentioned law. Why shouldn't law be taught to everyone, at least one course? So everyone who is affected by the law, who lives under the law, has a little bit of a sense of what it is. That's part of a civic education. And reading great history, obviously, gives us perspective on what we do and our decisions. Literature inures us to the English and other languages, which we use to communicate, to write. I certainly became a better writer through reading novels as well as through reading philosophy. So there it is. You can't ignore the values of those things.
No, I don't think you can. I think if you do, it's like that old saying, those people who are not familiar with history are destined to repeat it.
Right. George Santayana said that.
Oh, that's who that was?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that. I guess my liberal education wasn't that good.
Well, I'm struggling to get the exact quote myself, but it was something like that, very much.
So, well, Jeff, this has been a fabulous conversation. Thank you. As we always do, we wrap up with our two questions. So if you would, please, three takeaways for university presidents and boards.
Well, first of all, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Liberal education is a ticket to a higher economic reward, higher civic and cultural reward compared to STEM and vocational education. It's pretty much that simple, and that's not to disparage STEM or vocational. I support what President Biden is trying to do to get more and better jobs for people who are high school graduates. but that shouldn't prevent us from trying to get as many people in and through college as we can, more prosperous society, culturally, civically, and economically. A second point I'd make is that, as I mentioned earlier, the schism between liberal learning and practical learning, or between knowledge and skills, is as old as our republic. But Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, who founded the precursor to the University of Pennsylvania, had a different vision for education as being more than just a pre-professional exercise. And I think they were right. John Dewey thought they were right. Many people have followed in that tradition. There was a dispute, for example, between W.B. Du Bois, who was the great Black sociologist, and others around the turn of the 20th century about how to educate African Americans. And Du Bois said they should be given liberal arts educations, and others like Booker T. Washington were saying, no, they should just learn skills. Well, if they just learned skills, you wouldn't have a Hampton Institute. You wouldn't have all of the HBCUs. You would lose a lot, enormous cultural capital in the Black community if that case had been won by the skills-oriented folks. So to wrap it, I guess I'd say I recommend, as a somewhat of an outsider, independent scholar, but I'm very interested and very passionate about learning. Educators need a broad, robust vision of education that begins with citizenship, period. And then it includes skill-based learning, but also recognizes that the skills of citizens, which is what the Romans called artis liberalis, or the liberal arts, are the most important skills for any free society.
Those are great takeaways. Thank you. So what's next for you? Another book on the horizon?
Possibly, Drumm. I don't know for sure. Yeah, it's too soon to say. This one just came out hot off the press, and it's available at roman.com, ROWMAN.com. But as a writer, I basically see my role as being to inform, to provoke, to stimulate, and hopefully broaden people's horizons and leave them not dumber than they were before, without having any pretense of anything more than that. And when I think about what has informed, provoked, stimulated, broadened my horizons, well, it really comes down to two things, primarily philosophy and baseball. So we'll see what happens and whether there's another book there.
Very good. Well, let's hope you're not on the pitch clock.
Oh, please, don't get me started on that.
Jeff, thank you. It's been wonderful having you on the show. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Drumm. I greatly appreciate being on with you.
Take care. Thanks for listening today, and a special thank you to Jeff Scheuer for his sharing with us his perspectives on the importance of a liberal education and what university presidents can do to ensure they are graduating job-ready citizens, not just job-ready graduates. Join us next week when we welcome Dan Mabel and Catherine Campbell from the Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce. Dan and Catherine will be joining us to talk about their recent report entitled 10 Education, Training, and Work-Based Pathway Changes That Lead to Good Jobs. Until next time.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode, at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.